All right, hello everyone. Welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center webinar. My name is Dan Jeline with the UNC Highway Safety Research Center and the Ped Bike Information Center. I'm welcoming you to another session. We are today going to be talking about school streets, specifically how we re-envision streets around schools and really think about this through the lens of and as part of pandemic recovery. Some really hot topics that I'm sure you're all wondering about and working on these days. So we've got an excellent panel lined up to talk to you and share their stories about what they're doing with respect to school streets. So I'm glad to have you here today. Before we get into it, I just want to go through a bit of housekeeping. You may be new to PBIC webinars. If you are, welcome. We're glad to have you here. You're going to be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar, but you are going to have an opportunity to submit questions. So you have a questions pod in your GoToWebinar control panel. We'd encourage you at any point, whenever you have them, please send us your questions. We have a lot of presentations scheduled, but we have about half an hour at the end set aside for Q&A and discussion. So we're going to want to get into your questions and ask our panelists what are the things you're wondering about. So provide those to us at any time. We are archiving this webinar in terms of both having a PDF copy of the slides up online, which we have there now at our website. We're also recording the webinar and we'll post the recording to the same page. So you can visit it at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars and navigate to this session. I'll also send a direct link out in the chat momentarily. We're providing a live transcript of today's webinar. Again, this link is one that I will put in the chat momentarily, so you can visit that and access a live transcript of the entire presentation today. We're going to be providing certificates of completion and attendance to everyone who attends today's webinar. That will come in an email later today. We've got the webinar approved by the American Institute of Certified Planners for 1.5 CM credits. So if you're a planner and you usually claim those, you'll be able to get those just by visiting their website. The follow-up email that I mentioned that'll come later today will include all of this information, a link to the archive page, a copy of the slides, your certificate, and other resources that we'd like to share as part of this webinar. And we encourage you, as always, to review any episodes and webinars you've missed in the past and consider signing up for some of our future webinars. I'd like to provide some brief introductions to our panelists who are joining us today. First, our moderator for today's session will be Nancy Pullen-Sufert, who is the director of the National Center for Safe Routes to School, located at the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, where she's been focused on pedestrian and bicyclist safety and mobility for the past 18 years. Among other work, she's been heading the Committee on Safe and Healthy Return to School during COVID and beyond. So we're excited to have Nancy here to help moderate this discussion. Rachel Buck is joining us as well. Rachel is Principal City Planner at Transport for London, and she is a specialist in walking and cycling policy and program development. In May 2020, Rachel wrote TFL's School Streets Guidance for Boroughs, supporting the delivery of over 300 school streets, and has since led research into the impacts of this program. Rachel also leads the Strategic Monitoring Program for Streetscape for London, the transport response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and acts as strategy lead for walking at TFL. So we're pleased to have Rachel joining us today. Ashley Reed is also with us. Ashley has worked as a transportation planner at the Seattle Department of Transportation since 2013. She's focused on pedestrian safety, including safe routes to school, and works to make it safer for people of all ages and abilities to get around Seattle on foot. So we're very excited to have Ashley with us. We're also joined by Lauren Hassel, who serves as Safe Routes to School coordinator with Arlington Public Schools in Arlington County, Virginia. In this Virginia Department of Transportation grant-funded position, Lauren coordinates APS SRTS programming, planning, outreach, education, events, and evaluation, working with APS and county staff, students, families, community organizations, and partners to advance active transportation and safety. So I know I'm so excited, I'm sure you all are, to hear from our panelists today. What I'd like to do next is turn things over to Nancy Pullen-Sufert, our moderator, to really kick us off. So Nancy, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. I want to add my welcome to each of you on the webinar today, and also want to recognize that we're joining together on May 25th today, 1 year since the murder of George Floyd. Wherever you may be located, I hope you're hearing institutional racism, diversity, equity, and the role of law enforcement being discussed more now than they were 365 days ago, including in relation to the trip to school. So today's topic, as Dan mentioned, is re-envisioning school streets as part of pandemic recovery, and certainly is a timely topic for us. With the COVID-19 pandemic having caused widespread school closures, as you all know, and students not doing the usual commute to school, I think we all became more attuned to the impact school has on parents' ability to work and the related economic impacts of that. For kids, we've heard about the academic loss and mental and physical health struggles. So it's a hopeful time now as we emerge from the most intense days of the pandemic and see most schools offering in-person learning as an option today. Now we're hearing strong commitment to return in the fall to full-time in-person school. So what are the possibilities for us to do school travel better? What are the ways we can address long-standing inequities, address safety problems for students who walk from home or transit, support those families who have a newfound interest or ability to walk and bike? And how do we shift the thinking of parents who might feel like the COVID safest thing to do is to drive their child to school? As you all know, it's easier to get buy-in from partners and decision makers when we can point to other places that have adopted new practices, such as changing street access to make more space for walking and biking. So in that spirit, our speakers today are really going to offer some valuable expertise to share about what they have already implemented that you can go back and talk to your partners about. So one note before we launch in with our speakers, I am confident that you're going to take away some ideas from the webinar today, but I also want to honor and note that many of you have been thinking about school travel and about COVID accommodations and about what next year will look like and what's happening this year. So we also have a request for you, a call for good practices that I've posted into the chat, where we're looking to learn more about what your community is doing to support safe school travel and minimize private vehicles coming to the schools. We're particularly looking for travel practices that might have been developed with COVID precautions in mind and that could be valuable to continue even once we aren't needing to mask and social distance. Please just email me directly with those. You'll see my email address in the chat. Don't worry about trying to post them now. I want you to be able to sit back and really hear from our speakers. Also, just a note, we have one other resource to augment what you're hearing today, which is our PBIC resource, Re-Envisioning Streets Around Schools to Support Walking, Biking, and Play. And I'm going to drop a link in the chat for that for you as well. So on that note, I want to step aside so you can hear from our speakers, starting with Rachel Buck of the UK School Streets program. Rachel, I want to turn it over to you, and thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. I will just share my screen, one moment. Okay, everybody should be able to see that, but somebody shout if you can't. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. You know, it's a real privilege to be able to sort of share the experiences that we've had delivering school streets over the last year internationally. So I'm very excited to be here today. So thanks so much. Oh, don't tell me. Here we go. I thought that was going to be the first technical hitch, but we're there. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about Street Space for London. And this was the emergency response to the coronavirus pandemic in London. So essentially, you know, we very quickly recognised that there was going to have to be a response on street. London is quite a crowded city and the need for social distancing has now been in place for more than a year. So we really had to think about how we could reallocate street space away from motorised vehicles to provide more space for people to safely move around the city, whether that be by walking or biking. And this was particularly important because you can see by this graph here that public transport use in London is really high. So pre-pandemic in 2019, about 40% of all journeys are made on public transport. And you can see what happened as we sort of progressed through last year. More people were getting in their cars to avoid public transport, but also many, many more journeys were being made by walking and cycling. And at one point, almost 50% of trips in London were being walked or biked. So we really had to support that and try and encourage those kind of new habits and new experiences that people were having, to encourage them to be able to continue to use those modes of transport as we move out of the pandemic. So that's why Street Space for London was launched. It was launched to provide space for social distancing, encourage active journeys, and to prevent a car-based recovery from the pandemic. So what did it involve? There was a number of different types of schemes. Firstly, temporary cycle lanes and wider footways. Secondly, additional space for people walking and cycling in town centres and also at transport hubs. And then finally, which is what I'll talk about today, there was low traffic neighbourhoods. And just to introduce kind of this concept to you, in residential streets in London, like the number of motorised vehicles has massively increased over the last 10 years. And that's mainly due to navigation apps. So Google Maps, for example, will route you the quickest way. So 10 years ago, unless you knew London very, very well, you would generally stick to the main roads. But now we have a lot of traffic on residential streets where people live, and that has reduced the road safety. You know, there's more vehicles, more speeding vehicles. So a low traffic neighbourhood essentially aims to remove vehicles from residential areas by putting point closures in so that you can still drive to your house if you live within it. However, you can't drive through that area and use it as a rat run. So low traffic neighbourhoods have been a really big programme, and they sort of have accompanied school streets. And in terms of how many has been delivered, so since January last year, or March last year, let's say, to January this year, the schemes we implemented were 84 kilometres of 24 hours, 7 days a week bus lanes, so that only buses can use those lanes at that time, 90 kilometres of new cycle routes, 22,500 square metres of footway reallocated to pedestrians. There's a project in London to kind of retime traffic signals as well to give priority to pedestrians. And the reason for doing this in the pandemic is to kind of stop there being large groups of people gathering at the traffic lights waiting to cross. So it's giving priority to the green man. And then 89 low traffic neighbourhoods, and quite remarkably, over 300 school street schemes. Now, to put that in context, you know, when I spoke to Nancy briefly when we were planning this seminar, you know, she was like, well, how did you get to more than 300? And so I wanted to show this graph because it shows how we deliver in London. So London is split up into different local authorities, and there's 33 altogether. So it's the responsibility of each of these local authorities to manage their roads, and particularly the roads that schools are on, because they will be local streets. Now you can see here that and I think this is a bit of an underestimate, to be honest, in this graph, because it's a bit out of date. But there's some boroughs that are now getting towards having 10% of all schools now have a school street, whereas pre-pandemic, we only had 80 across the whole of London. So you can see there's been a really rapid change, and many London boroughs have really kind of got on board and are planning and delivering school streets. Now, it looks on here that there's quite a number of boroughs that don't have any, but that's not actually the case. That, you know, like I say, this is probably a little bit out of date, and I think there's probably only 2 boroughs that have not got any school streets now. So this is huge progress that's been made in this area. So why school streets? It became very apparent very quickly that they'd be an important part of the pandemic response, because they're needed to provide space for social distancing, particularly where there's very narrow footways outside school, and parents would have to queue outside the schools to pick up children. Of course, they can encourage active journeys, more walking and cycling, reduce car trips, and also improve air quality. And air quality is a big issue in London. We have, you know, illegal levels of certain pollutants. So anything that we can do to improve air quality, particularly for children, is really important. We also wanted to deliver school streets because they can be delivered very rapidly. They're relatively inexpensive, and we tend to have good levels of community support for them. So in a recent poll, just from a couple of weeks ago, 60% of Londoners said that they agree with the creation of school streets, but more importantly, only 12% disagree. So it's kind of hard to argue against something that's going to improve the health of children with relatively little impact. There are obviously people that are impacted and who do not like the schemes, but generally, it's hard to disagree with the fact that they're a good idea. So what is a school street? What do we mean by that in the UK context, at least? So it's a timed access restriction to motorised vehicles at drop-off and pick-up. And the reason I'd say it's an access restriction is because some vehicles can still enter the street, and it would depend on the policy of each individual borough, so one of the 33 boroughs, to decide which vehicles should be allowed to enter the street. Typically, it will be local residents that live inside the timed access closed area. So residents, blue badge holders, who are people with a registered disability in the fact that they need to use their vehicle to help them travel around. And in some cases, certain types of taxis would be allowed into the scheme, perhaps if they're bringing the children to school, or if they are transporting children who have special educational needs. In terms of how long the closure would last, it's typically between 45 minutes and 2 hours. When our schools first reopened the first time round, which was back in June last year, many schools were kind of staggering their start and finish times so that each class would start 10 minutes after the last one. So that the start and end of the school day had kind of expanded over a much wider area. So normally a school street would be 45 minutes, but at the minute there are school streets that are 2 hours at either end of the day. Like I say, only pedestrians and cyclists can enter the zone, plus the exempted vehicles who are allowed access. And the road closure is enforced using either a physical barrier, cameras, or street design, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. It's also important to say that each scheme reflects the need of the school and local community, and local authorities will do their best to engage with the school and the local residents to try and determine what the scheme should look like. And often there's a question over how big the zone should be. Should it be really big, which could be of benefit because it's a bigger space that you're providing for people on foot and by bike. However, what we can find is if the scheme is too big, you dilute the impact because you get more people who are able to drive. So more residents would have a permit to be able to drive in the zone. So actually we recommend keeping the zone relatively tight when you're designing it. Also to say some school streets are full road closures, so they just completely close off the road at all times, but it's really context specific and depends on the design of the street and where the school is and the layout, etc. So moving on, this is a nice diagram that a campaign group put together. So with the rollout of school streets, more people are hearing about them and more people are wanting them. So this is a diagram that kind of is a bit of a checklist as whether or not it's worth campaigning for a school street at your school, and it's aimed at parents. So firstly, to check, is the school on a main road? If it's not, does the main access meet constant essential traffic? No. How many bus routes are there? So these are all the things to consider, like whether or not a school street would be feasible. We do have school streets that have buses that are on bus routes, and we use bus gates for those. So it's essentially a camera operated scheme where the bus would be able to drive through freely, but other vehicles that would drive through would be issued with a penalty ticket. So it is possible, as long as the buses aren't too frequent, it is possible to do a school street where there is a bus route. Just some examples. This is the school called Ivy Bridge Primary in Hounslow, and you can see here just how relaxed it is outside the front of the school. That mother can stand in front of the street saying goodbye to her son. You can see the signs that are used here to let motorists know that during those times of operation they cannot access the street, and the camera signs means that there will be a camera there, and we use number plate recognition to identify which vehicles are allowed to be in the zone, and therefore which vehicles would be issued with a penalty if they were not supposed to be there. Now, I've shown this photo in another presentation, and people have kind of commented on the number of cars that are already on the street. And I think this is a block of flats here on the left, like an apartment block. So these people would have their car there, it would be stored on the street, and they would be able to drive. But you know, essentially it's stopping additional vehicles moving into the street. So this just shows a map of this scheme. The blue dot is the school, and the blue line shows the shape of the street. It's called a cul-de-sac. We have lots of these in the UK, and schools are often kind of located at the end. So it's almost like a dead end. Once you've driven in, you'd have to turn your car around to drive out. You can't drive through. So that in itself creates a safety risk because you've got vehicles turning in the street. So that's a really good reason to close off the cul-de-sac at pick-up and drop-off time to improve safety for children. I have another example here. This is in a different borough called Lambeth. And this is an interesting one because this school has 2 entrances on 2 different roads, and this borough have closed off both of those roads. Now, when the schemes were delivered very quickly as part of the emergency response, the way that we recommended that boroughs do it is by using these collapsible barriers and also the signs to say that the road is closed. So the tricky bit about this is that somebody has to be responsible for putting the barrier out and taking it back at the end of the school day. And in many cases, the schools have recruited volunteers to actually stand at the barriers and talk to drivers as they approach and let them know that it's a school street. So that was more than a year ago, and I think in many cases those volunteers have now been replaced by cameras as schemes are being made permanent. But for those schemes where they haven't quite got to that yet, they are experiencing volunteer fatigue and struggling to kind of get people to do it. So it definitely worked while there was the emergency in the pandemic, but it's not a long-term solution. So once again, this just shows the map with the school and the fact that there's 2 closures, one at each entrance. So this is just some more photos of schools and streets in operation. This one again is in Lambeth. You can see the parents waiting quite comfortably in the street for their children to come out. And this is a nice one in Enfield. And I think when schemes kind of transition from temporary to permanent, we like to look at what else we can use the space for. And you'll notice the planting on the street there. There's some like really beautiful planting, but this is really important in London to reduce surface rainwater runoff. If we have a lot of rain, there can be floods. So we're trying to kind of incorporate planting and things like this into schemes as they become permanent for sustainable urban drainage. So it's important to think, the wider objectives of what can be achieved with the school street. Now, I've talked a bit about this already, so I won't linger too much, but the different ways that the school street can be enforced. We use the number plate cameras, volunteers and movable barriers or gates. There's physical bollards, so some of these can be dropped and lowered by the caretaker at the school, for example, or a full road closure where you just close the road off completely. But there would need to be sort of no access requirements for the street to enable someone to do that. Now, what have we learned from this last year? I talked already a bit about volunteer fatigue. Although many boroughs have acknowledged that it's been really useful to use this method of using volunteers because it shows that the school is committed to making the scheme work. So if the school can find that many people to stand and talk to drivers, sometimes you can be quite aggressive and threatening. It does show that there's a real need for the school street in that area and that the school is committed. It's really good to find schools that are already engaged with travel planning. So what I mean by that is that the school would actively be promoting sustainable travel to school. They would talk to the children about road safety. They might do things like cycle training for children. So if the school is kind of already engaged in this and it's part of their curriculum, then once again, it's more likely to be a successful scheme. It's important to fully engage and consult prior to implementation. So talk to the community, talk to different community groups, make sure that you have, like a representative engagement. So you're just not talking to those people who typically answer surveys and consultation. Like the more you can do to really bring in local residents and sell the benefits of the scheme, the less chance that you have of opposition to it. And also just a note about signage. We found that as well as having the signage at the start and end of the school street, you need to warn drivers in advance so they don't approach the school street. So just kind of coming towards the end now, we had this great opportunity with more than 300 school streets to do an evaluation and to find out what the impact had been. So we did a survey with parents and carers at 36 schools, half of which had school streets, half of which didn't. And we found that there was a really good level of support for school streets. We found in terms of behaviour change, it was very difficult to disentangle the impact of the school street versus COVID-19 because everyone's lifestyle has changed so much. People are working from home. So the question, why are they walking to school? Is it because of the school street or is it because of COVID-19? We did find a measurable impact in people driving less because of the school street, and I'll show you that data later. But it's a really tricky time to do research. And also parents at the School Street School definitely have benefited from greater safety and ease of active travel. Now, in terms of the resident interviews, it was interesting because residents had actually very limited awareness of the local School Street scheme. So these would be people that were living just outside it, very close to it, but not within it. And they had mixed views, and they tended to think it was a good thing if they weren't inconvenienced, but if they were inconvenienced, then obviously, you know, that did shape their views. So this graph here just shows that the impact when people were asked, are you using more or less of the following modes of transport? We saw much more walking because of COVID-19 and the School Street, slightly more cycling. But importantly, if you have a look at the car use there, which is the key thing that we're trying to do, the School Street reduced car use by almost, well, 20% of parents said that they were driving less as a result of the School Street. And then finally, in terms of kind of improving the environment around the school, you can see that those at intervention schools, so that's schools with School Street, are less concerned about danger from traffic. More of them are reporting that the street is safe and easy to walk on, it's easier to cross the road, it's easier to cycle on. And everyone in London is dissatisfied with air quality, but you can see that they're much less dissatisfied if they have a School Street. And to kind of accompany this, air quality sensors were placed at 18 schools, and there was a measurable reduction in nitrogen dioxide on the School Street. So that's just really fantastic news for public health. So in terms of the next steps for School Street in London, we really need to support the boroughs in transitioning from temporary to permanent schemes. The pace of delivery over the last year has been absolutely immense, and the workload that's accompanied that has been the same. So we really need to focus on making these temporary schemes permanent and turning them into something really, really amazing. This example here shows the School Street kind of before and after, and it shows what can be done. So this whole rain garden, there's a path through the middle so children can walk through over the sort of the little river. There's lovely planting, there's seating, there's cycle parking. So, you know, we can be really ambitious with what we want the School Street to achieve. So that's sort of my key recommendation really, is to think about the wide range of objectives that a School Street can deliver and build that into your long-term plan. So that's me done. You know, I'm happy to take any questions, and I think Nancy will sort of field those at the end. So I will hand back over.
Rachel, thank you. And you're right. We have some people who are putting questions into the chat as they are listening to you. And for our audience, of course, feel free to keep doing that. And we will address as many questions as we can at the end. And now I'd like to turn it over to Ashley Reed with Seattle Department of Transportation. And thank you for being with us, Ashley.
Thank you for having me. I will show my screen now. Okay. Well, that was a very fascinating presentation, and my wheels are turning now, thinking about the Seattle School Streets program and how we can take some lessons learned from London. So I'm Ashley Reed, and I'm going to be talking about our Seattle School Streets program. And oops. It's not going. There we go. So the Seattle Department of Transportation vision is that Seattle is a thriving, equitable community powered by dependable transportation. We're committed to 6 core values, including equity, safety, mobility, sustainability, livability, and excellence. We have a race and social justice initiative that requires us to evaluate the impact of our programs and projects on people of different races and ethnicities. We have a Vision Zero program that has a goal of reaching 0 serious injuries and fatalities by the year 2030. And we also have a climate goal of 9 out of 10 trips being fossil fuel free within that same time period, so by 2030. So today I'll talk about our School Streets program, give you a background about what led to the development of the program, what School Streets are, who is allowed on them in our Seattle version of them, where they are, the process to get one, and what we're looking to in the future. So schools reopened this spring with in-person learning during the pandemic with very short notice. Our governor gave school districts just a couple weeks to reopen, and until that point, it wasn't looking likely. So it sort of it felt like it came out of the blue. There are 2 daily start times and 2 daily end times instead of 1 of each. And there's also no general education bus service. So because school reopened so quickly, the bus entity that the school district contracts with was not able to basically rehire all of the drivers that they had lost. So we really wanted to answer the question, what is SDOT doing to support families going back to school? And the school district also wanted to answer that question since they were not providing bus service. In 2020, SDOT started a Stay Healthy Streets program, which, similar to London, is a street that is closing the street to through traffic while opening it up to people walking and biking. And these in Seattle are on our neighborhood greenways, which are streets that prioritize people walking and biking. So they already are set up to really be a safe place for walkers and bikers. We've had an existing permit program for many decades that allows schools to close the street to traffic in the morning and afternoon at arrival and departure times. But the permit has a fee, an initial fee and an annual fee, and the permit process is fairly challenging for a typical school to go through. So basically all of that led to the start of our School Streets program. So school streets in Seattle are 1 or 2 blocks adjacent to a school where we open them up to families walking and biking. We no longer allow through traffic or parent drivers. They are in place 24/7 and they are opt-in only. So schools need to specifically request them. So I show here an example at Whittier Elementary School. The 2 streets in purple are closed to through traffic and parent drivers. And then I also give an example of what our traffic control plan looks like. So school streets help to provide social distancing space. They help to reduce traffic congestion, which helps improve air quality. They also help to sort of organize the drop-off and pickup activity and spread it over a wider area of space. Typically, parents want to get their car as close to the front door of the school as possible so they can kick their kid out and watch their kid walk to the front door of the school. But that's not physically possible for everyone to do that. So when you take that out of the equation, the pickup and drop-off activity is sort of dispersed across the street network. It really improves safety for people walking to school because there aren't people driving across those key crosswalks that are leading right to the school. And we think and hope that it encourages walking and biking to school. So on Seattle school streets, residents who live on the block are allowed to access their house. Deliveries, waste pickup, emergency vehicles are all allowed on the block. District provided transportation, which right now is only special education and something called Zoom and taxis, which are mostly for foster kids and kids, homeless children. Also students with mobility needs that are arriving in a family vehicle. So we, in communicating with some schools in particular that have high populations of students with medical needs, we learned that it was not reasonable for us to increase challenges of getting to school for those populations. So who is not allowed is through traffic. So general traffic of people who want to go through the area, and then also parents. So school streets are on non-arterial streets, so not the busy streets. We are looking at streets that don't have a public bus route, and we're also working to not create any new dead ends. So we don't want people driving down a street, not realizing that there's a school street there, and then either having to make a U-turn in the street, or because these are just 1 or 2 blocks, deciding to drive through the barriers and just scoot 1 block. We currently have them at 8 public schools, but we're still adding them even though we just have 3 weeks of school left. And as you can see, they're sort of dispersed all throughout the city. The ones to notice in particular are the ones at the bottom of the map in Southwest Seattle and Southeast Seattle. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in my presentation. So the process to get a school street is pretty quick and easy. We added a form on our website, a Microsoft form, or families or schools can just contact me directly. All principals and PTAs were notified through the district, so they were given this information from the district, which sort of gives it that credibility and legitimacy that the district supports this program. Our Transportation Operations Division reviews the request on a SharePoint spreadsheet. So we are looking at the same document. I put it in, let them know on Microsoft Teams that, that there's a new request. They go in and they either just approve it or set up a meeting to discuss if they have any questions. And then they also provide the TCP. We're using a third party to set up the barricades. And we provide flyers to the school that they get out to all of their families, and then we mail a postcard to the neighbors. So the process can take as little as 1 day. If a school contacts us towards the morning of 1 day, we can have everything in place for the next school day. And this is really the only program that we've ever had that we can take action in that quickly. So we used a street closed sign and not a local access sign, and that removes the street priority from the vehicles and makes it okay to walk in the street legally. And we are doing these on a request only basis because that gives a really strong nexus between a specific need at a specific school with our action. So we're not, going around the city implementing these everywhere. We're doing these specifically where the school is saying they need the school street. So that helps with neighbor support, because when we haven't had many neighbors push back, but when they do, we can let them know that this was specifically requested by the principal of the street. And it also increases parent buy-in when they know that this is something that the staff, the school administration and staff support. We do not enforce school streets. I'm very intrigued to learn about this camera enforcement in London. The City of Seattle does have a speed photo enforcement program. Our 20-mile-an-hour school zones on arterial streets, some of them are photo enforced, so we do have precedent for a camera program, but we don't have the nameplate recognition in place. So that's something that I'm definitely going to take back and explore. The school identifies the street to close based off of their needs and their traffic circulation. SDOT manages the street closure, so we are putting or using a third party to put out the barricades. We are taking the liability and not the school. So we're not doing this through a permit process. And for that reason, they're in place 24/7 until the end of the school year. So we are asking that schools and families don't touch the barricades or move the barricades, but if they see any issues, to let us know. So looking at the future of school streets, we are developing an evaluation process to take a look at whether school streets in Seattle are sort of resulting in what we would want them to, mostly around improved feelings of safety and support for the program. I'm not sure that we would see a real strong mode shift from them. I think that they do encourage people to walk and bike, but we're not creating, this isn't Stay Healthy Streets where we're creating whole routes of closed blocks. These are just 1 or 2 blocks. So I don't think that it likely results in like a very large amount of mode shift, but it does support people who are walking. It does support people who are parking a few blocks away and walking in. And it definitely creates a much more relaxed feeling around pick up and drop off. So we'll be surveying schools that are participating to learn about their experience with the school streets. And then we're also going to be looking at how the program should operate in the future. So when we developed the program, we had basically a week and a half to get something in place to support schools. So we knew that going the permit route wasn't going to be an option in that time frame. We also know that there are a lot of schools that simply will not go the permit route, even if we make it free, even if we make it very simple to apply for. The schools that were on the map towards the south of Seattle that are participating in our School Streets program, I feel very strongly that they would never participate in a permit program. These are schools that we've worked with in the past. They don't have PTAs, they don't have the capacity to apply for a permit and manage the barricades and bring them in and out daily, but they are participating in this School Streets program. And I think that really shows that that we need to continue to offer the SDOT managed option. But we're going to be going through this evaluation process and getting information from the school district about their support for the program, and getting information from the schools that are participating about what their experience has been and whether we're meeting their needs, and whether they would have interest in participating in a permit program in the future. And here's my contact information if anyone wants to contact me after the presentation. And with that, I will give my screen back to Nancy.
Ashley, thank you. We're getting a lot of questions in the chat. People are very curious, Ashley, about some of the details regarding implementation. So hang tight, everyone. And I'm really looking forward to welcoming Lauren Hassel with Arlington, Virginia Public Schools to talk to you about sort of a broad range of intervention measures that they have been using to support walking as part of school return. So Lauren, turning it over to you.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Ashley, and everyone who's put this together. It's really been a privilege for me to be involved, and thanks to the Highway Safety Research Center and the Ped Bike Information Center as well. My name, as Nancy said, is Lauren Hassel. I am the Safe Routes to School Coordinator for Arlington Public Schools here in Arlington County, Virginia. My position is actually funded by the Virginia Department of Transportation, and we've had this funding. It's basically funds my position and some additional work and supplies and equipment and so on for 8 years now. So we've been very fortunate about that. In the first 5 years of the grant, we were housed in the Teaching and Learning Department with health and PE, and actively involved in classrooms and teaching bike safety and doing assemblies and kind of encouragement activities. Then in 2018, the position was moved to the Facilities and Operations Department of Arlington Public Schools in anticipation of a series of school openings that were going to happen, and a lot of kind of groundwork that needed to be done in encouraging walking and biking for new schools and new school populations. So I am now officially part of the Department of Transportation with Arlington Public Schools, and specifically the Multimodal Transportation Planning Department, which is my boss and me. And just to give a little background of the lay of the land here in Arlington, we are actually right across the river from DC. For those of you who don't know, we're Arlington, Virginia, not Texas, and the geographically smallest self-governing county in the country at 26 square miles. So we're a very densely populated area, very connected to a major metropolitan area, kind of a urban suburban feeling here, a very diverse population as well, and fortunately for all of us, very transportation rich, with everything from metro rail and bus service to bike share, scooters, trails, highways, you name it. Arlington Public Schools kind of reflects the Arlington County population, as you might expect, with an ever-growing student population. And the number of students actually this year has gone down a little bit because we've had some students with COVID go to private school, and some will be coming back. We won't know for sure for another couple of weeks, but we do anticipate it will continue to grow. We have a very diverse community of 150 nations represented, 114 languages, and also socioeconomic diversity with free and reduced lunch. All modes and means are represented in our student population. We also have packed into our 26 square miles 41 different schools and programs, 23 of which are elementary, so that's K through 5 plus some pre-K. We're adding a new school this coming year as well. And then the 6 middle schools, a secondary program, which is 6 to 12, and 11 high schools and programs serving up to adults. And as I mentioned, I'm currently part of the Department of Multimodal Transportation Planning, and that our grant funding is the reason for my existence. But there is plenty of work to be done, whether or not we have a grant. So I'm very fortunate that we've continued to receive funding for all these years. So this is kind of the lay of the land until March 13th, 2020, when our schools closed down, much as they did around the country around that same time, and we had to pivot. And I think pivot's been a very well-used verb this year, noun, verb, whatever. So responding to the closure and then immediately beginning to plan a reopening, not knowing when that would happen, but knowing that when it did happen, we needed to be ready and we needed to be proactive, and we needed to cast a wide net to involve as many people as possible who could help us do the right thing and think of every possible nuance and every possible angle and every possible solution. Initially, we were shooting for reopening in September of 2020, and then that kind of got pushed to November, and then we thought January. Ultimately, we opened in a hybrid form, so partially virtually and partially those who wanted to come in person in March 2nd, actually, almost a year after we had closed. And we gathered together a variety of people over that year, really from the get-go, but to work consistently week in and week out to kind of tackle what the major issues would be in reopening schools in current conditions, and then looking ahead to what we might be able to gain from a bad situation and turn lemons into lemonade. So among the people that we had involved, or among the departments rather, is within the schools, we had our facilities folks and school and community relations, which is basically communications, the teaching and learning and instruction folks, planning and evaluation, and then with our county partners, we had transportation, engineering, and operations, and parks and recreation, communications again, health and human services. With police, they manage their special operations, manages our school resource officers and crossing guards, and their communications team supported everything. And then we had a lot of partners in the community, ranging from advocacy groups to advisory groups. We were very fortunate to have a Vision Zero action plan under review at the time, or being drafted at the time. So there's a huge group of engaged people already that we could tap into for ideas and support. And we also have, of course, our customers, who are the schools, families, students, staff, volunteers, PTA, all being part of this process. And then we had underpinning everything, the support of the Safe Routes program here in Virginia, as well as in the DC metro area, which is the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia, and nationally with the Partnership for Safe Routes and then the National Safe Routes Center. So all those folks, not necessarily every week and not necessarily all of them, but in some way or another participated in a variety of ways. The three main ways were 3 work groups that were formed. The first was a walk, bike, access work group. The second, park and walk, which is essentially just keeping single occupant vehicles away from campus, and the full group of pretty much a representative of all the folks that are included in our team. And the tasks at hand were really defined by social distancing and the fact that school bus capacity was limited to 11 students per trip, from anywhere from 38 to 60, depending on the size of the child in normal conditions. So in order to somehow get students to school efficiently and back again, and not have just buses running all day long and delayed arrivals and delayed departures, we had to try to increase operational efficiency by reducing demand on the buses. And there are only so many ways you can do that, but one of the most obvious was expanding walk zones or walk and bike access. So that was the first work group that was formed, was to develop or to really identify which schools might have that potential to expand a walk zone, and then to go about making it comfortable for families in the area, and also just to make sure that we had thought of everything to increase the safety. Basically, the expanded walk zones were a mile radius around our elementary schools, but some of our walk zones are kind of have like a bite taken out of them, and are less than a mile in some areas because of intersections and crossings that are less than ideal, or other variables that make that particular little piece of the walk zone not as conducive to especially younger commuters. So you'll see in the map on the slide here in the upper right corner, there is a blue section of the larger pink walk zone. So that blue section was what was added on. It is 1 mile from the school, but it was originally given bus service. So these families were all of a sudden turned from bus riders into walkers. So to support them, we created various resources. Well, first we communicated with the school and let them know what was afoot, no pun intended, and consulted with all of our partners in the county and the police and just the PTA, people who live in the neighborhood, about what the most desirable, most comfortable, most recommended routes would be. And then created, the purple on this map is what we suggested as the best routes for students coming from that neighborhood to get to school. And that was based on a series of walk audits and different kinds of resources that were brought together to come up with a final map, as well as supports in encouraging everything from walking school buses to just safety devices and different ways to get to school, and again, avoid families deciding to drive instead of walking. Then the second approach, I guess, to helping minimize the demand on buses was looking at the walking zone and the area outside of the walk zone, and the families that might choose to drive regardless of whether they were changing from a bus rider to a walker, or just they preferred to drive. And spoiler alert, this is not a school street solution, but it's kind of like a mini version of that. So parking and walking, we looked at remote locations near school to make sure that those who would be driving would park far enough away from school, A, because we didn't want additional people on campus, and B, because the families must still wait for, or whoever is driving the students would have to wait until their student had passed the screening in order to go to school. So that's not a simple task. It involved a lot of work with the community, work with existing parking restrictions, development of signage, development of communications to families in those areas who are used to dropping off at the front door practically, and just kind of trying to change behavior with enough advance notice that we could avoid any real crises when schools did reopen. And again, all of this is going on over the course of months, and not knowing exactly when schools would reopen, but all these were being developed and with all the experts and the people who know the area and are able to kind of convert the information into something that's understandable to a family with small children or middle school students and high school students. And then we also had a series of efforts looking at the different crossings and areas that, with the expanded walk zones and throughout the county, areas that were less than desirable crossings, and what areas were greatest need for supports in crossing, with a limited number of crossing guards and a limited number of actual school staff or community volunteers who could help with crossings. We were able to actually prioritize the locations and triage the available guards, despite some reductions in guard staffing, and cover the areas that were of greatest concern. And we're still, that's kind of a daily thing. We're hiring crossing guards. We understand that that's a problem nationwide. It's a difficult job, but it's so important. And the delay in reopening definitely impacted our available resources in that regard. And then we also looked at, and again, I say we, but this is primarily the engineering folks with the county and with different inputs from neighborhoods and from the schools themselves. We looked at different engineering capabilities. Infrastructure-wise, several different pilot projects were put in place over the course of the months leading up to school reopening, including a lane closure, a temporary lane closure along one of our busiest corridors, a 4-lane road that connects, there are three schools along that road. By closing one lane, it allowed more room for students to walk to school, and some of these students go as early as 7:15, 7:20 in the morning. So back in March, it was still dark at that time of day. Using bollards and barriers and other temporary interventions. And then another location was more of a parking lane closure, again, closed off temporarily with bollards and signs to allow more room. It was a broken sidewalk link there, so allowing more continuity along the commute to school to encourage walking. And additionally, we had signage created to support the park and walk areas, explaining, this is where you need to park if you're walking to school, this is where teachers can park, and then closer to campus if they were having student testing in a particular location where cars could pull up and wait. All that signage was necessary, and all of it had to be, the community also had to be made aware of it, not just the families of the schools, or the students rather. We also have variable messaging signs and more non-infrastructure solutions like pedestrian flags, more bike racks put on campuses where we could, and even kind of fun tactics like traffic gardens that kind of fall more under the engagement and encouragement category, giving students a reason to, maybe schools are closed, but to come to a school campus and practice biking on, on a surface that's near the school that gets them biking and doing and learning safety kind of on their own. But underscoring everything was the fact that we looked at all schools the same way, and with the equity front and center. Everybody was kind of suffering from the pandemic. Everybody was impacted in one way or another, but everyone, transportation, school travel is kind of a common denominator. Everyone needs to get to school to be able to learn. So we looked at things as to the extent possible with the same lens, and looked at it as a school system instead of a system of schools, with a lot of communication and coordination with the individual schools and principals, and respect for their communications channels and their ways of doing business. So kind of now that we've returned to school, and it's been about 2 months almost 3 months now, we have a little perspective on some of the things, the benefits that have been gained by these different changes we made, but also in just kind of the larger consciousness of the community. And one of those areas, which I'm sure everyone's experienced in one way or another, is the sense of behavior change, and kind of more of a willingness, a more open-mindedness when so much is changing and so much is of necessity, to just be a little more flexible. To look at, more people out walking and biking because they had time, or because for whatever reason, to make that more of the lifestyle when we return to the life as we knew it before. And then the sense that community, that everyone is impacted in some way, that we're all in this together. And APS even had in their outreach, when we started to reopen, the hashtag Forward Together as kind of our motto for how we were going to proceed going forward. And then in terms of sustainability and what we might be able to keep and what we are planning on keeping, is some of the expanded walk zones have worked flawlessly. We're doing surveys to make sure that families that were affected, either if they have ideas or if they have reasons why they didn't use the resources available or decided to drive instead of walk, we will address those, and then hopefully apply to other schools where maybe the expanded walk zone wasn't embraced, but we might be able to tweak it in a way that would be, again, encourage walking and biking over personal vehicles. And then with the park and walk intervention and encouraging remote drop-offs to keep single occupant vehicles away from the campuses and add a little walking to the morning, whether it's just for the students or the parent and the student walking toward campus, really improves safety on campus, manages the arrival and dismissal process, and just it's a win for everybody. The only people who may be most adversely affected be the neighborhood, where they're used to having on-street parking and maybe it's taken up by these temporary remote drop-offs in the morning and in the afternoon. But overall, that seems like it's something that's sustainable. And then some of the tactics that we use to make things fun or make it more of a community, encouraging walking school buses, which, groups of kids and an adult or two walking together to school, to the same school, bike trains, kind of the same, but on bikes. We also have a program called iRide, which is public transit here in Arlington for students is half price with a student iRide card. So we weren't encouraging that so much during the pandemic because ridership was limited, just like on school buses. But now that we are returning to full operations in the fall, we'll definitely be encouraging that program again. And a lot of what we've learned, we can apply, hopefully not of necessity, but maybe just in the planning to keep in our safety toolbox, as the county folks have come to call a lot of these different adaptations we've made. In case of future crises and emergencies that emerge, it may not be a pandemic next time, it could be some other type of emergency or natural disaster, who knows, but we know that we can adapt, we know that we can flex, and we know that some of these approaches are available to us and that they've been proven in the past. And then in terms of just lessons learned in working with the community and our peers, we are ultimately a school system, and therefore the business is teaching and learning, so that usually takes precedence. So being able to advocate for transportation needs and stressing that students need to be able to get to school to learn at school once COVID is over gave us more of a seat at the table. And an understanding that transportation and school travel is part of everyone's lives, and therefore really needs to be considered in looking at each child's experience from the minute they leave the house to the minute they get home. Also looking at our partners who really gave so much of their time and input and experience and expertise, recognizing that, that this was other duties as assigned. This was something that nobody expected, but everyone stepped up and helped out. But there is a limit, and there, when it stretches on over a year, it becomes more and more of a burden. So we are very fortunate that we were able to reopen in just a year and be able to kind of put a lot of what we had planned into practice. And then there are some new variables that we did, you never can anticipate, but just the larger context, looking at what we were doing and then having development such as new CDC guidance, 3 feet distancing instead of 6 feet, that changed how the buses were calculated and how classroom capacity was, and what opportunities were available for families to change whether their students would come to school in person or to stay virtual. So we could never have expected those things. And the same just more recently with the new mask guidance, that if you've been vaccinated, although schools are still in the category of where you have to wear a mask, but a lot of these things are out of our hands, but we have to be ready and poised to address them and incorporate them as need be. And then wild cards are things you, I guess, intuitively could sometimes expect if we had the distance from the work we were doing. But for instance, a lot of families perceived if the school buses were operating, trying to reduce capacity or trying to reduce the number of riders to make sure those, the 11 or now the 21 number is adhered to, they felt like they were taking one for the team by driving to school, which is counter to what our goal is. We want people to walk, bike, and take the school bus as kind of public transit for students. But they felt like they were doing what was helpful, which is something you couldn't have anticipated, but it does make sense if you rationalize it. And then piloting some of our temporary infrastructure changes during a time when not all the students are back in school, when the school schedules were divided into two-day-a-week groups of students. And then even in those subsets, not all students were coming back in person. We just did not have as many students walking and biking to school, we didn't have as many students coming to school. So that isn't always the best time to determine whether the value of the project can be demonstrated. So those are just lessons learned. And then for me personally, I come from more of a communications background, and I've learned a lot about engineering and planning and transportation and all the ground truths that play into this. But at the bottom line, whether we know what's going to happen or don't, the importance of communicating constantly to all the folks who are affected. And when it comes to transportation, everybody's affected in some way, to keep people informed and educate and communicate and respond when we have questions or concerns raised in the community. Just being out ahead of all of that and trying to be as on message consistently with all of our partners, sharing the same messaging, but adapting it according to the audiences who range from our own colleagues and partners to the general population through media, and then just kind of the grapevine, word of mouth in a geographically very small community with a lot of tight neighborhoods, and schools are like miniature neighborhoods within a neighborhood. There's a lot, if something gets out that's not correct or that needs to be clarified, it's important to be able to get out ahead of that and to use the channels that people are used to tapping for reliable information. So to really be respectful of the communication process. And where possible, we provided almost everything in English and Spanish, and then made other translations available as needed. And then last but not least, in terms of the big picture, kind of looking at some redefined ways of looking at the student experience and Arlington Public Schools planning as a whole. There's really a new recognition of the role of transportation in school operations, not just as a function of school buses, but all that goes into behind the scenes of routing and looking at walk zones and looking at the different elements that are at play in a comfort level of an elementary school student as opposed to a middle school or high school student, and a broader definition of safety. Traditionally as kind of physical safety, but I think with COVID, there's mental health has become a big concern for a lot of the students who are at home, and the safety of not just at school, but to and from school, and throughout their lives, learning more about school travel and walking and biking to school, but also walking and biking in general is a life skill and a confidence builder. And the instruction around that can take place. It's ideal to have it take place in school, but if school is not meeting, there are other ways to get around that. And we have, luckily, a lot of technology and tools like traffic gardens and videos and so on that we are able to use to kind of bridge the gap during COVID. And then in terms of safe routes to school, we've really been kind of elevated in terms of the role that we can play in a lot of the different planning processes from engineering, from looking at things from the lens of our youngest travelers, our youngest commuters, looking at engagement and being able to see things from the different audiences, the different people who are affected by the decisions being made or the planning being done. And equity, looking at all students, all modes, all ages, all neighborhoods, all schools, trying to be the leveler, the one who represents all the entire student population in terms of getting to school safely, and having a seat at the table in a lot of these conversations. And I guess ultimately the biggest indicator of how the value of safe routes to school principles and practices has risen, or at least awareness of it has risen, is the fact that the funding for grant funding that we've depended on for years has been cut severely in Virginia and will not sustain a full-time coordinator. So we were able to submit a request for funding for a full-time employee in this capacity as part of Arlington Public Schools budget. And that actually was approved just last week. So that was very good news. And we will see how it plays out in the school year ahead in non-COVID circumstances. But having that agility and that ability to adapt in all these different ways, using all the expertise and resources available to adapt to something that nobody knew was coming, but that everybody responded in a way that was constructive, really positions us to be in a good place for fall when we will go back to 5 days a week, And we are still offering some in-person learning for those families that choose it, but the majority of students will be back in the classroom. So with all of those kind of smaller tactics and no big school streets or anything like that, just wanted to give you a little snapshot of what's been going on here in Arlington Public Schools. And looking ahead, we hope to be able to talk more about how it's become embedded and made us function more effectively in the future. So thank you very much. And here's my contact information.
Lauren, thank you so much. I really appreciated your presentation in that it helps remind all of us of the having a look under the hood, whatever the equivalent of walking and biking hood would be, into the backpack, of how complicated it is and how many people are involved when we all needed to be very adaptable, as you say, and think about how we're going to continue to support school travel in very different circumstances. So I'm sure many people on the call today can appreciate and relate to some of the process that you described, and also appreciate hearing more about how some of the strategies that Arlington came up with to address them. The extended walk zones, for example, and using a travel lane to create more space for walking and biking are such interesting and big things to tackle. So right now, we're going to go ahead and transition over to audience questions. And thank you to those of you who have already submitted lots of questions. You are a curious group out there and really want to know more details from each of our speakers today. So I'm going to start with a question that I'm going to ask each of our speakers to respond to: Rachel, Ashley, Lauren. And forgive me, because I'm going to roll a few different audience questions into it. So overall, the question really is around how has your organization considered equity in the activities that you described today? And each of you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I thought it might be valuable if we could sort of lift those pieces up. And I'll tell you, we got some questions specifically about, gosh, how did you address engaging parents at schools in low-income neighborhoods, or schools where parents just have less of an opportunity to be involved? We also had a question about, hey, do any of you have schools where closing a school street causes a disproportionate impact on low-income families that might need to drive further? And I don't know if that was a scenario for any of our speakers, but I wanted to offer that up. And then we also, in a similar vein, had a question about signage, kind of specifically for Ashley. But you know what, let's hold off on the signage question because there were a few different questions about signage. So let me just turn it over to Rachel first. If you could speak a little bit more, Rachel, to how your organization has considered equity in some of your activities.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Nancy. So in terms of equity, I guess the first thing is trying to understand where we need to invest in London. And we look at deprivation, because there are really stark inequalities within London. And so say, for example, if you live in a more deprived area, there's higher rates of childhood obesity, air quality would be worse, you'd be more likely to be a victim of road danger, so the roads are less safe, less access to public transport. So there's kind of all of these things that can help address that, can be delivered in school streets and other initiatives like that are similar to this. So we definitely look at our planning stage of where to invest. I'd say during the pandemic that happened less, because the priority had to go to spaces where there was a need for social distancing, so where space was constrained outside the school. So that would have kind of gone ahead, irrespective of which kind of area that school was in, so it would have benefited all communities. But moving forwards, it's definitely considering all that information when we decide where to invest. Is about making sure that when we engage with parents, that we've got a really robust engagement plan that accesses the voices that we don't tend to hear from. Prior to the pandemic, with this kind of thing, we would stand outside the school, you know, a group of people would stand outside the school and talk to parents and try and engage them in surveys. That's been a lot more difficult because we haven't been able to do that face-to-face contact. So it's definitely something that did suffer last year. But as we move forwards, you know, that's sort of at the heart of everything we do, really. And then finally, I'd say it's just really important to monitor the impact that your scheme has as well. So we always build in a monitoring strategy from the outset that does look at the impact on different communities so that we can identify, you know, if there are disproportionately negative impacts on particular groups. And with regard to the question about low-income families needing to drive further, that can be the case in London. And it's that kind of, I guess, with a school street, you're not stopping somebody from driving. They might have to park slightly further away, but you know, people can drive, and the school street zone is actually very small, so you wouldn't be preventing that person from driving. But like I kind of outlined, in the more deprived communities, the harms of motorised vehicle use are so much more strongly felt. So the school streets are, you know, hopefully addressing some of those inequalities. So yeah, I hope that's answered your question.
Thank you. Ashley.
Yeah, I would really second a lot of what Rachel said in terms of the benefits of school streets, addressing some of the harms that you might see more of in the lower income parts of the city. And we really took the approach of an SDOT-led, SDOT-managed street closure because of equity, because we knew that if we were putting it on the schools to apply for a permit, pay for a permit, get the barricades, manage the barricades, put them in and out every day, that the schools, you know, our high priority schools just would not have the capacity to participate in that. And so that's why we really decided to go the direction we did, where all they have to do is tell us that they want us to do it, and then we'll take care of it from there. So we tried to make it really as easy as possible for those schools to participate, and we're really relying on the school administration to be determining whether that is a benefit to their community or not. But like Rachel said, this is just 1 or 2 blocks that's closed, so that it's not creating a burden on families who need to drive.
Thank you. And Lauren.
Well, I would just add, since we weren't as involved in school streets, but in terms of just the way that transportation is understood to be such an important part of every student's day, and the student who misses the bus but doesn't have a parent at home to drive them to school, or the one who's babysitting for a younger sibling and is therefore late, and the different situations that individual students have at home, and looking at the whole child and not just the time in the classroom and how their grades are. I think that's been one of the things that's come out of from the equity side of looking at COVID, and maybe some of the benefits is that level of awareness. And then the other part, in terms of outreach, we definitely have, as I mentioned, kind of a system of schools rather than a school system, I guess, and respecting each individual school's way of doing business and understanding of its own population, and working with the principal and the staff to understand, does this school need X, or do we need to have a translator at the PTA meeting, or do we need to communicate with WhatsApp instead of just a traditional electronic media, or do we need paper copies of things? The engagement process to make sure that we are really reaching everyone. Folks who are new to this country, folks who may not be able to, due to their work schedules or other family commitments, be as engaged or as informed, and where a lot of that burden falls on the student to make sure their family is aware of things. Just everything that we could to make it easy for everyone to know what they need to know to make the right decisions about the transportation that was available to them.
Yeah, thank you for that. We had several people who had questions specifically about the Seattle signage that's being used. So Ashley, hoping to get a few more details from you about that. we had one person who wanted to know, do people understand that street closed, which is what's on the sign itself, the street closed, does that help people understand that they can walk in the street? And this particular inquirer says, we're trying to figure out the right language, and especially when they're considering translating it to other languages. So any thoughts on your experience there?
Yeah, so we in addition to the street closed sign, we also created a school street sign that's also put on the barricade, and it was in my presentation as well. So we do have some language on the sign, but most of it is images showing the modes that are allowed on the street. So in addition to that, the school is really communicating to families about how they can use the street, and letting families know that this is a place for them to be walking and biking.
Perfect. And that actually rolls very nicely into another perennial question, which is for Rachel and for Ashley around liability insurance. And can you talk to us a little bit about sort of how liability is addressed when you're putting up signs and making changes to the street? Rachel, did you want to start?
Sure. So in terms of signage that we use in the UK, it's all very heavily regulated. So you can only use, the exact wording on a sign that would have a specific meaning and implication. So there's little kind of room for changing the wording on signs or things like that. I hope, does that answer the question? I mean, the only other thing to consider, I guess, is the fact that we use volunteers to sort of steward the school streets as well in some cases, and the liability for that would actually fall within the school because they're from the school community. So it is a decision for the school to make whether they are happy to accept the responsibility of those stewards being out on the street and taking that role.
Yes, that's similar to the Seattle situation as well, and the liability is also one of the reasons why we went the direction of having SDOT do the closure, so that SDOT is taking on the liability. One of the challenges with going a permit route is that then the school is taking on the liability, and the school has to be managing the barricades, and that is a barrier to some schools in participating. So the way it is now, the city is taking on the liability for the closure.
Okay. And this is a question that I want to start with Lauren around, and again, kind of a logistical question as people are picturing the interventions that you're talking about and trying to figure out how would they make it work where they are. This is a question really about remote drop-off, which relates really to Lauren, Rachel, and Ashley, each of you, what we were talking about. But Lauren, you sort of also mentioned the fact that where your remote drop-off was located had to also be a place where parents could wait while their student was having their wellness check. So can you just talk a little bit more about how you went about identifying drop-off locations and any sort of other special considerations there?
Sure. Arlington schools are in neighborhoods ranging from a relatively urban areas where there's nothing but parking meters to zoned parking in neighborhoods to very suburban locations where it's just an inconvenience for, a homeowner to have a car parked in front of their house, but not really changing the dynamic that much. So working with the county who controls parking and the restrictions and the communications around that, and then determining, the distances to the schools and safe crossing of students to the school from the remote location, with the understanding that most elementary students would probably still be accompanied by their parent or the driver to the campus, and the student would then go from there. But yeah, having to really coordinate both the impact on the school and the individual student family commuting and the neighborhood. So we would have the support of the community, understanding that it was just a portion of each day, and and possibly a temporary measure, and that we were willing to work with them to make it as palatable and reasonable as possible.
Thank you. And then
Sorry, I didn't mention the signage as well, which I did mention in the presentation, but yeah, signage was created and posted. So that was another big effort, not, you know, it's actually just getting out and putting out lots of signs and putting them back when the weather gets in the way and things like that. So it's a really all hands on deck kind of effort.
Okay, well then I'll go ahead and ask the question that people typically now ask, which is, you know, how did you address community pushback around taking some parking space?
Generally, with the appeal to the community good and the short-term nature of it and the need for everyone to kind of pull together during the pandemic, and then talking about if it is something that we want to look at for the long term, doing deeper levels of engagement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Okay. And then I think this is probably going to be our last question. I just want to circle back on something that I think Rachel and Ashley both spoke to, but it's worth revisiting again, which is about students with mobility challenges. So if it would be difficult for them or not possible for them to walk or bike, how do you allow for access to the school in those instances?
Sure, I can go first if that works.
Sure.
So essentially, yeah, any student with a mobility issue, they would have an exemption from the school street. So they would essentially get a permit to access the school street, which would mean that there would be no penalty for their vehicle if they were within the zone. So, you know, every local authority would manage a list of permit holders. And, you know, like I talked about, that would mainly be residents, but it's also people with disabilities that would need to use their vehicle to access the school. It's really important that that facility is there for them.
Thank you. Yeah, and Ashley.
Yeah, we also have that exemption. So students with mobility needs can access the school street. We don't have enforcement. It's all self-enforced, but the communication from the school to the families lets them know that students with mobility needs can access the street.
Right, right. And Lauren, did anything you want to add?
No.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, we are coming very close to the end of our webinar time. So I want to be sure I have a chance to say my sincere thanks to Rachel and Ashley and Lauren. Thank you to each of you. Thank you to those of you on the line who have listened with interest and proposed some great questions. And I hope you are leaving with some inspiration and some very concrete ideas. And I guess I'll also just say in closing, I was talking with a pediatrician the other day, and she said, you know, I don't want us to go back to normal. I really think this is our opportunity to move to something better than where we have been. Let's not go back there. And I really think each of our speakers today really spoke to the possibilities for a better future. So I appreciate that. And I also just really am reflecting on the incredible amount of creativity and thoughtfulness that communities and staff have when they come together and try to figure out how to address big challenges. And I'm also just looking forward with curiosity to see how we can impact things this coming fall and continue to encourage and support that people can walk and bike to school safely, that they can get on a bus or transit if that's what they need, and that we're able to limit the number of private vehicles that need to arrive at a school. Dan, any closing comments from you?
I just want to echo your thanks to the panel, Nancy, and to remind everyone out there that you'll be getting an email from us just a little while later this afternoon with details about the archive page for the webinar, your attendance certificate, where you can go for more information about these topics. So be on the lookout for that. Also let you know that as the webinar closes today, you'll be greeted with just a few questions about what you thought about the webinar and an opportunity for you to share with us some of your priority topics for our future sessions. So please share your thoughts with us there. we do take that information and use it to plan our future offerings. So, and I just want to say a big thank you again to Nancy for moderating today's discussion, Rachel and Ashley and Lauren for all of your work on your projects and providing your presentations. Thank you all so much, and we hope you join us for our next webinar.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.